Let's say you've applied for several jobs. You are now hoping and waiting for one of them to call you to set up an interview. But before you get that call, you need to think about what accommodations you will need and what is best for you. You need to have a plan. There are many accommodation options to choose from when considering what will be best for you. This workshop will focus on the use of an interpreter during an interview. Specifically, we want to talk about these two things. The first one, how to make an arrangement for an interpreter during a job interview. The second one here, what you can expect to happen during that job interview. Some people wonder if requesting an interpreter for an interview is worth all the trouble. The answer to this question is a definite yes. If having an interpreter present is the best accommodation for you, then that is what you should request. In an interview, you must give the employer the best impression that you can. And this includes being able to answer their questions and ask questions that you may have of your own. Remember, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, you have the right to equal access to employment opportunities. Part of that is the right to communicate effectively with an interviewer so that you can show them that you are the right person for the job. So again, yes, it is worth it making sure you have an interpreter at the interview. Now let's talk about how to make arrangements for an interpreter during a job interview. There are basically two ways to arrange for an interpreter to be at your interview. Request an interpreter from a government agency or other organization. Or, number two, request that the employer provide an interpreter. The first thing you need to do is request an interpreter from a government agency or other organization. For example, if you're working with a government agency like Vocational Rehabilitation, VR, they may be able to help you by coordinating and paying for interpreters for interviews and different job fairs. If there isn't VR available, there may be other organizations in your area, such as Michigan Works, or the other one listed here, the Center for Independent Living, CIL. If there's another interpreting organization that you may know of, feel free to contact them. If it just so happens that you're not in conjunction with VR or are unaware of other organizations, then you should contact the company and inform them that they need to set up the interpreter. If you plan on contacting the company and letting them know you need an interpreter, be sure to contact them in advance. The company will need time to work with a coordinator in scheduling an interpreter for the job interview. Don't just assume and think the employer knows what to do and that you'll show up with an interpreter present. If the company knows that you are deaf, but you fail to inform them you need an interpreter, they are not required to provide an interpreter. You don't want to show up for an interview expecting an interpreter and find that they were unable to get one because you asked too late or didn't ask for one at all. Don't sacrifice your ability to communicate and your chances of getting the job because you did not plan ahead. What if they say I have to pay for the interpreter? Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, all employers with 15 or more employees are required to provide reasonable accommodations. This includes your interpreter for the job interview. You may need to politely remind them of their responsibility under the ADA. If you continue to have problems making the arrangements with the employer, then you may need to contact an outside agency for assistance like VR or the Center for Independent Living. And finally, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The acronym is EEOC. You should not be required to pay for the interpreter yourself. Now that you have made the arrangement for an interpreter to be at the interview, let's talk about what you can expect on the day of the interview. It is good practice to arrive early for the interview. That way you can meet your interpreter prior to the interview and discuss any questions you may have. At first, the interpreter will most likely speak to both you and the employer before the interview starts. It's the interpreter's responsibility to describe what their role is in the process. And if the employer has never used an interpreter before, that's their chance to explain the process. Just like the interpreter may ask the name of the job, description of the posting, any kind of special vocabulary that may be used during the interview process. And now second, discussion with you, the candidate. The interpreter will introduce themselves. Nothing more, unless you need to ask questions or discuss anything. If you feel comfortable in discussing that, I encourage you to inform them the name of the job posting, the candidate, maybe show them your cover letter or resume. The interpreter's responsibility is to facilitate communication between the two parties. But little background knowledge about the situation will also help the interpreter do their job as effectively as possible. If you are not used to working with an interpreter, you should mention this to them so they can help you understand how the interview will work. If you've worked with interpreters before and want them to do things in a certain way, then this is the time to explain to them what you want them to do. During the interview. If things are going smoothly during the interview, the interpreter will facilitate the conversation between you and the employer, and all will go well. If the interpreter is spending a lot of time asking, "Do you understand me? Do you understand?" or "Am I clear?" repeatedly, if you notice the interpreter talking a lot with the interviewer, that means that there may be some confusion or difficulty interpreting the interview. You can probably expect some or all of these to happen during the conversation, which means if you see the interpreter saying they don't understand or they're not clear, it's important not to ignore that. If the interpreter isn't clear or you don't understand, it's important to inform them to repeat themselves or clarify what they said. The interview is the interpreter's responsibility just as it is yours to ensure that everyone has clear understanding of the communication. If there are any problems beyond basic clarity and understanding, then you may need to make some tough decisions about the situation during the interview. If the interpreter is not working out, then you may need to consider stopping the interview and rescheduling when a different interpreter is available. While rescheduling your interpreter should be the last resort, it may be better for you to stop the interview and reschedule, finding a different interpreter to ensure fluid communication, rather than putting up with the interpreter and experiencing frustrations which makes a bad impression on the company, and they may not want to hire you. Now that you know how to make arrangements for an interpreter and what to expect during the interview, it is now time to develop your plan. Don't wait for that first employer to call. Figure out what you're going to do and be ready for when the calls and interviews start coming in.